All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Missey. For those of you who don't know me, I worked on a project called Minimizing Your Carbon Footprint with my partner, Madison Brinkley, for this class. And the idea behind our project was to calculate what the carbon footprint is of the average American, but then also to take a more detailed look into that figure and determine what kind of lifestyle choices could be made to help reduce your carbon footprint. So firstly, I think it's important to mention what a carbon footprint is. As I'm sure many people are aware, research over the last few decades suggests that humans are responsible for the majority of greenhouse gas emissions today. And it's these emissions that scientists regard as your carbon footprint. So that is how much greenhouse gas and CO2 are you responsible for emitting into the environment. And this is an important figure. It obviously matters because greenhouse gas emissions contribute to global temperature changes, particularly the increasing in global temperature changes. And that, of course, is connected to climate change. So we've already seen the lasting effects of this process on the world around us, whether it be the melting of the polar ice caps, the frequency of wildfires, frequency of flooding, and other weather and natural phenomenon. So we've already seen the impacts of trapping of greenhouse gas emissions in the world around us. And so it's important to consider how much our footprint is contributing to those changes. So calculating your carbon footprint, it's actually quite a simple thing to do. There are a few calculators, online today that claim they are able to calculate your yearly carbon footprint based on a number of figures and things like that. The one that you see on the screen right now is one that we initially used to kind of get an idea of what this figure should look like. It's from the Nature Conservancy, excuse me again. Feel free to check it out if you're interested. But the idea behind our project was to examine these figures more closely and figure out what kind of changes you can make in your life to help reduce your footprint. So we kind of broke that up into three categories. The first category was travel, and then home use, and then food consumption, like the most basic categories we could figure. And so this first category, travel, we took the average distance an American travels each year, and used figures for the average miles per gallon of a typical gasoline car, and the average CO2 emission per gallon of gas. Did some math, as you can see off to the side there, and calculated that driving a car upwards of 13,000 miles each year, with an average miles per gallon, contributed close to 11,000 pounds of CO2 each year. The next category was air conditioning. This fell under home use. So using figures from the EPA, we figured out that approximately 93.7 million households in the US use air conditioning. And there was a figure floating around, that 117 million metric tons of CO2 figure, for how much CO2 is produced by AC usage in this country each year. So that was a case of simple division, and we got the figure you see there below. Upwards of 2,000 pounds of CO2 is contributed per household each year for AC usage. So on the other side of this, we also did heating. So there was a figure that claimed 0.99 pounds of CO2 was emitted per kilowatt hour of energy. And kilowatt hour of energy is the unit that we used across the project to determine and measure energy use, including that the average amount of energy used to heat a home each year is 18,000 kilowatt hours. So as you can see off to the side, that was a case of simple multiplication, and we got a figure that was upwards of 17,000 pounds of CO2 each year. Finally, we did appliances, but we didn't want to get too detailed with this, so we picked 4 of the most basic appliances we could figure that most everyone has in their household, and calculated that these appliances together contributed upwards of 2,000 pounds of CO2 to your carbon footprint. And then we calculated the entire home use category together and found that about 23,000 pounds of CO2 each year makes up that category in your carbon footprint. So the next category we did was food. Obviously, as most people talk about, whenever they talk about your carbon footprint, it's meat. So that was an obvious topic that we had to explore. We picked 3 of the most popular kinds of meat in the country: beef, pork, and chicken. And using these figures, calculated that if you consumed as much meat as the average American, at the rate of carbon-2 emission of each kind of meat, that eating that contributed to upwards of 4,000 pounds of CO2 to your carbon footprint every year. The next category we did was grains and dairy. So, of course, there's lots of different kinds of grains and different foods for that, but we picked 3 staples, which were bread, rice, and pasta, based on average American consumption rates and the average CO2 emissions for producing each kilogram. We determined that grains were responsible for close to 200 pounds of CO2 each year. Meanwhile, dairy products, we picked milk and cheese, 2 of the most simple, and did the same kind of calculations and found that those contributed to roughly 700 pounds of CO2 each year. The next food categories we did were vegetables and fruit, and this is where it gets a little bit more complicated. So, as I'm sure everybody is aware, there's multiple kinds of vegetables and multiple kinds of fruit. But using a source, we kind of did a random sampling of CO2 emissions and calculated the average CO2 emissions for a kilogram of vegetables. So that figure for vegetables was 0.643. For fruit, it was 0.712. And then we used, again, average American consumption rates to determine if you actually ate that much fruits and that much vegetables each year, this is what your carbon footprint impact would look like. So that was upwards of 1,000 pounds of CO2 each year. So the largest contributors to your footprint were the transportation, including driving a gasoline car, heating your home, and meat consumption. So transportation, again, was close to 11,000. Meat consumption was close to 4,000, and you can see in the pie chart off to the side there that home use figured for the majority of your carbon footprint, at least in our project's analysis. So what can you do? Part of our project, like I mentioned, was examining the lifestyle choices you can make to help reduce your carbon footprint. So we did a few calculations in our project, but for this presentation, we included just one. So a hybrid vehicle, using EPA figures, we were able to calculate that a hybrid vehicle produces around 5,000 pounds of CO2 every year, which is basically half that of a traditional gasoline vehicle. So if you were to drive a hybrid for the average 13,000 miles each year, you'd be contributing less than half the CO2 produced by a traditional gasoline vehicle. You can also consider taking public transportation. So again, we used EPA numbers to figure out that buses emit upwards of 8,000 pounds of CO2 each year, but it sounds like a lot. But if you consider how many people are on a bus and how many people that takes off the road in individual cars, that figure is much less and is much more efficient. So consider taking public transportation whenever available and get yourself out of that car. So next couple things you can do, of course, eat less meat. Not advocating for any particular diet or anything, just, the numbers show that taking at least 1 serving of meat out of your diet each week can help reduce your carbon footprint quite significantly. Additionally, when it comes to washing your clothes, you can also consider using cold water. We have found a figure that said you could save 350 pounds of CO2 each year by doing so. So, error analysis. Of course, the scope of this project was very small, and our estimations, therefore, are also very small. There are a lot of categories of lifestyle that we just didn't mention, including plastic bottle use. Plastic production makes up a large portion of, or not a large portion, a significant enough portion of CO2 emissions worldwide. So that could have been an interesting category to explore. Additionally, looking at Energy Star appliances versus regular appliances, which is what we use for our own calculations, how much energy that would save. And then also a category that I don't think a lot of people think about was new and thrifted clothing. So new clothing actually has a pretty big individual carbon footprint. So thrifting clothes can help minimize that as well. But those are all things that we considered looking, but for the sake of this project, to keep it simple, did not. So take our numbers with a grain of salt and just know that they could be much larger.